There are a few documentaries that have exposed the likes of SeaWorld at the level of Gabriela Cowperthwaite's 2013 Blackfish. The documentary film details the events surrounding the 2010 death of SeaWorld trainer Dawn Brancheau and the life of Tilikum, the orca responsible for her death. The largest recorded orca whale in captivity, Tilikum was responsible for the death of 3 people, 2 of which were aquatic park trainers. However, Blackfish goes beyond Tilikum and explores the history of orcas in captivity and the treatment of them by SeaWorld and their sister aquatic parks, spanning 30 years from 1983 to 2013. It takes on the form of an expose documentary on what leads to aggressive behavior in captive orcas, and how the violent cases of them injuring and killing trainers are the fault of corporations like SeaWorld for putting them into environments where they become mentally traumatized. Now, one would think after multiple recorded injuries and a handful of recorded deaths, SeaWorld would start to question the safety and morality of keeping these animals captive. But as Maggie Nelson expresses best in her books The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, chapter Great to Watch, this assumption relies on the hope that shame, guilt, and even simple embarrassment are still operative principles. Such a presumption is sorely challenged by the seeming unembarrassment of the military, government, and corporate CEOs. So Blackfish is not a call to action for SeaWorld to suddenly change their minds, but rather for the audience to reflect on their own involvement and financial contributions to the aquatic theme parks keeping these animals captive. Thus, the film truly aims to use its format to open the audience's eyes. Through the progression from marketed SeaWorld videos and music to real environmental sounds and amateur camera footage, Blackfish takes away the power of SeaWorld's false portrayal and shows the audience the reality and dangers of orcas being kept in captivity through their building unease. In the beginning of the film, we are shown the happy image of whales and trainers in the water that SeaWorld wants us to see. The footage features a lot of wide, majestic shots with a very calming score. The viewer is meant to associate positively and familiar with this image. Those of us that have grown up going to see whale shows with our families are told that the animals are harmless, loving creatures. This, of course, makes them more marketable. As ex-SeaWorld trainer John Hargrove states in his memoir Beneath the Surface, SeaWorld's corporate marketing strategy turned the orcas into the pandas of the sea, commercial and cuddly, with little hint of the complexities of killer whales and the effects of confinement on them. By utilizing wide camera shots and covering the environmental sound with music, this SeaWorld approved image is distancing the audience from the animals themselves. We don't see any of their humanizing features and don't feel connected to them as intelligent beings. Rather, they are an animal and a commodity for our entertainment. As the documentary goes on, we begin to lose these wide shots and are instead shown a perspective closer to the whales. The introduction of real environmental sounds further distances the audience from this commercialized view and puts us into the real, objective environment. With the absence of music, the audience is finally able to hear the lone sounds of water splashing around, making us feel closer to the actual tank. This feels a lot less comfortable than the happy music overlay that was first introduced. On top of that, we begin to hear more sounds coming directly from the whales in distress. In one sequence of the film, some trainers talk about a mother orca's reactions to being separated from their calves. The orcas become visibly and audibly distressed, crying out in grief as a human mother would. We are finally given a glimpse into their intelligence, and it's extremely heartbreaking to understand the emotional pain they experience. Hargrove asserts in his book, "I can't quite call them animals. The whales are beings just as we are beings." Beyond the auditory change in the documentary, the visual change of this section perhaps has a larger effect on viewers. At this point, Blackfish transitions to more medium and close-up shots of the whales, forcing the audience into what feels like closer proximity with the animals. This section feels extremely claustrophobic, and the audience is pushed further into the actual environment of the film. We are shown an increasing amount of close-up body parts of the whales, such as collapsed dorsal fins, bleeding scratches on their sides, and their eyes. To me, one of the most haunting visuals of the entire film is the close-up shot of an orca's eye. With their size and coloring, it's often difficult to see the eyes of an orca from afar. We usually associate their white eye spots with their eyes, making the animals seem much more cartoony. When looked at up close, their icy blue eyes feel eerily human, and you can visibly see a being capable of intelligent thought looking back at the camera. To see this kind of intelligent life swimming around in a confined pool space begins to not sit well with the audience. We begin to understand the gravity of what this life and environment could do to these animals not only physically, but psychologically. This is far from the only example of intelligent animals being kept in confined spaces. Scientific American's 2014 article, Free Willy and His Pals, details the negative effects of keeping animals such as chimpanzees, elephants, and orcas in zoos. Boasting some of the most intricate brains around, all three animals have recognized themselves in mirrors, indicating that they too have a concept of self. Some researchers have suggested that long-time confinement makes cetaceans psychotic. The film's sudden descent into more ominous music creates an increased sense of dread for the audience, knowing what they now know about the psychological damage and violent potential these whales have. What really changes the perspective of this section is the integration of handheld camera footage. For multiple of the attacks on trainers, audience members were present just on the other side of the pool where the whales performed. The film utilizes multiple recordings from civilians who were unfortunate to witness the attacks. These were mainly captured on camcorders and cell phone cameras, adding a layer of amateurism and groundedness to the footage. Rather than a refined, professional film camera, this lens feels like it could belong to anyone, including the film audience watching the film. The footage is grainy and shaky, making it feel more like something that wasn't meant to be seen. This handheld camera footage becomes the lens of reality, and the film audience is no longer able to distance themselves from the events happening right in front of their eyes. They become the in-person audience, and the stakes rise as it feels like we are seeing these horrible things happen, but unable to do anything to stop them. The transition from observing the events of the film to feeling like we are witnessing the actual events is a phenomenon explored by Sandy Flitterman Lewis in her analysis of Night and Fog, documenting the ineffable. As Night and Fog proceeds, the viewer changes from an observer of documented events to a witness with the capacity for moral judgment. With the observer, the camera documents. With the witness, the camera testifies, renders an account. The observer takes a detached stance toward the scene. The image becomes the visual equivalent of that staple of the newsreel, fact. By contrast, the witness has a subjective relation to the image, the ability to see oneself in the scene, transforming what is seen through the prism of human feeling by means of communication. Similarly to Night and Fog, Blackfish makes its audience confront their own involvement in the events of the film. Although many viewers of the film were not physically present for these attacks, many have gone to an aquatic performance in their lifetime. The millions supporting these parks are the main reason they still exist. Instead of watching the film objectively, the audience now has to question their own involvement and the encouragement and financial contribution during the time period of the film. The one question that still remains: is Blackfish a successful example of activist media? I personally believe that it is a successful documentary, but it does do so with methods that don't necessarily align with the film's message. The film is very intently about making the audience uncomfortable with the events of the film, with the hope that they will feel empathy for the animals. However, the sense of empathy is not necessarily what could change some of the audience's mind. While Blackfish claims to prove that it's not the orca's fault for them acting out violently, it still does perpetrate the idea that these are violent animals. Sure, it's not their own doing, but let us show you all the detailed, graphic ways in which these animals have maimed and killed humans. It feels like the audience is sprung into action to stop their support of these parks in order to stop these horrific and violent things happening to trainers, rather than simply out of love for the animals. Regardless, Blackfish is extremely successful at convincing those who watch it to see the errors of orca captivity and to discontinue their support of parks like SeaWorld. Since the documentary, there have been laws and acts proposed to end orca captivity. SeaWorld saw significant drops in their attendance and revenue following the film, and even announced in 2016 that they were phasing out their orca breeding program and would end orca performances at their park in San Diego. Successful activist film has the power to make real change, but if the 30-year span of Blackfish tells us anything, it's only the beginning.